Hi everyone, I'm Mary from Joyful and Mary Quilting, and I am excited to share my scrapbusting system with each of you. With each new project, it seems like I continue to customize my sorting process into a flexible and really a practical approach to organizing and using fabric scraps. Whether you cut your scraps into specific sizes or keep them intact, this system is all about tailoring your preferences and keeping your sewing room under control. Once your scraps are organized, please join me in the 2025 Joyful and Mary Quilting 30-day scrap busting challenge, and I'll show you how to piece perfect blocks. We're going to then sew them together to create perfect star points. In the process, we're going to use some valuable scraps that we've had saved for quite some time. But before we make our quilt, we need to organize our scraps. We'll be using this particular handout, and if you'd like a copy, click on the link below. So let's get started. The first question we have is, how do we even get started? When I started scrap busting, actually I was a scrap collector. I would collect all of my scraps in a big, huge bin, and it got to the point where that bin was overflowing and it was overwhelming just to look at it. So I didn't do anything with it. I just left it there. And pretty soon I was throwing scraps in there and they were falling on the floor and it was getting to be way too unmanageable. That's when I decided that I needed to do some scrap busting basically in a smaller bin. The large bin was not working. I knew that if I had a smaller container that held my scraps, when it was time to scrap bust, it was a more manageable amount that I could get done in one sitting, where the other one, there was no way. It would take me forever to do that. What I ended up doing with the other one is I shared those scraps with other quilters because, again, I knew I wasn't ever going to get to it. And then I started using my scraps this way. So the first thing that I would do, and I do when I scrap bust, is I go through and I sort my fabrics. Now you can sort them whatever way works for you. What do you use most often? I have some designers that I prefer. I have some that I have separated according to color. Others I have separated according to size and shape. It just depends, again, on what works for you. Now, as I'm going through this one, I can take a look. I like to sort the low volume or the background fabrics from those fabrics, those scraps that are more colorful. That's step number one. And I like to do that when, again, I have a bin that's just ready to be scrap busted. Just pieces like this, all sizes, shapes. I've got all these different pieces that I have been throwing into this bin. I'm going to put half of them in one stack, and then I'm going to put all of those that are more background type fabrics in another stack. That's all I'm going to do. I'm going to go through and sort this entire bin this way. Like I have some scraps that are just like this. I'm going to put them in their own pile. Once I have that done, that's when I'm going to examine each scrap and decide where they're going to go. They may need to go in a bin sorted by color. Some of my scraps are sorted by color. For example, this is my bin filled with yellow fabrics. So I have all these fabrics sorted and I did not cut them. I just kept them because some of them are fun kids prints. Some of them I just really may need to use them in larger pieces, but they're too small to put in my fabric stash. They just get lost there. So I decided I have a yellow bin, green bin, orange bin, red bin. They're about this size because they stack nicely. I put a lid on them and they can be put in a room without looking messy. So this is my yellow bin. Again, like I said, I've got all sorts of colors. So that's one way that I sort my scraps. Anything that's in here that may work in one of these bins, I get rid of it and I put it in there. These are larger pieces, as I said. They're not these little teeny scraps. So I have to be careful. I want to make sure that I have something manageable. The next thing I'm going to do after I've sorted through all my scraps, and I'm going to put these all back in because I'm not going to scrap bust right now. The next bin I have, this is Christmas fabrics. If you have holiday fabrics or a particular theme for your fabrics, I have these all sorted. I had fabrics that had been cut into strips, ready for a Christmas project. and I have them in this bin. And actually, this bin was probably twice this size when I started, but I use them, and I use them because I have them sorted according to size. I have 1.5 inches, I have 1 inch, I have 2.5 inches, I have 2 inch, I have 3.5 inch, and I keep them in here. When I'm ready to take them out, I can just pull them out. I can use whatever scraps I want. I know they're all holiday themed, and they're sorted in stacks according to color, green and red mostly, and then some background fabrics in here as well. Maybe you don't have room for all of those bins. That's where I absolutely love these project bags. You can get them on Amazon. You can buy them by the dozen, by the 2 dozen. They're really inexpensive. And in this particular bag, I have my autumn fabrics. I had a project that I worked on that was autumn fabrics, and I had some leftover pieces, and they were all the same line, so I made sure that I put the little tag in there so I knew where this came from, what fabrics they were. But I have them sorted, and the next project that I need, this was a fat quarter stack, and it was really rather large, but I used a lot of it. There's still a lot of good fabric in here, and I know that when I pull this out, it's all going to be by Autumn Fabrics, same designer, so they're all going to go together. When I'm ready for my next project, here it is. I also like to sort according to designer. So another bin, same size, and this is my Riley Blake bin, and I love Riley Blake fabrics, and so I have all sorts of Riley Blakes in here. In this particular one, I have some leftover layer cake squares. I have some 5-inch, well, these are 6-inch squares actually that I had cut. I have some large pieces. Some of these they're not quite fat quarters. Fat quarters had been cut. I took pieces out of them, and this was what was left. Too small to put in my stash. That's why they're in here, but I wanted them all to be with the same designer so that when I looked for fabrics that matched, these are all together. Now, as you can see, I do have some cut strips. I have these 3.5-inch strips. I use those a lot for foundation piecing. That's a favorite with me. 2.5-inch strips are also a favorite with me, as are 1.5-inch. So I do have those separated out as well, where I have cut those into pieces, and they are also ready to use. Again, I have some larger pieces like I have here underneath, but they're still very manageable. I've been using these. When I started out, I don't know if you remember last year, but I made the quilt from last year out of these fabrics, and I had a table about as long as, you know, a regular dining room table filled with these strips and scraps. But I used them because they were all organized, they were cut by size, and they worked for the pattern that I was using. Again, we all have different tastes. You have different tastes than I do. So maybe you love using the 6.5-inch strips or 6.5-inch squares, or maybe you like to use fat quarters only. Then you will organize yours that way. But I like to organize by color. I like to organize by theme. I like to organize by designer. I think that helps. And then I also like to separate out my low volume, those background kind of fabrics, from the fabrics that are actually more of a contrasting fabric that show up more. So that's me. That's what I like to do. The next thing I want to talk about is my actual Scrapbusting System PDF. Now, I told you if you're interested in that, there's a link. You can get this. I did have one from last year. This one has been updated, but it basically walks you through the 10 basic tips for organizing your scraps. And it gives you different hints on what you can do that might be tailored more towards your needs. Now, if we look at this, first of all, I have the Scrapbusting System labeled according to large pieces, pre-cuts, strips, and crumbs. Now, crumbs are pieces, for me, crumbs is whatever you want it to be. Mine is actually for anything that's less than 3.5 inches long and 1 inch or so or less wide. Those are pieces that I wouldn't necessarily use for most projects, but sometimes if you're doing something really fun and scrappy, they come in handy. So if you are into that, you can have a separate bin just filled with those crumbs. You don't have to press them, you don't have to do anything. You can just put them into the bin, save them for a time that you need. Now, in looking at this, half-yard pieces, those, sometimes we can buy half-yard pre-cuts. If they are a pre-cut that I have not opened the package yet, I keep all those together. I have a stack in my closet that has fat quarter stack, half-yard stacks, all my unopened layer cakes, my unopened jelly rolls, my unopened charm packs. I have those all together so that I can just go through and find what I need. But if I've opened them already, and I may have even cut out of a piece, that's when they become a scrap. So some of my scraps are rather large, and I can get a pretty good piece out of the scrap that I'm using. For example, if I have a fat quarter, maybe it has a chunk cut out of it, but I can still get a nice 10-inch square out of it, I'm going to do that. I'm going to cut a 10-inch square out of a particular fat quarter. Maybe I can get 2 out of it. Maybe the piece that I cut out was on the top of the fat quarter. So I like to look and see where I have usable pieces that I'm able to cut. I love saving the rest of the layer cake. When I've used part of it, I haven't used it all, because they really come in handy for many of our projects. And this is just my bin of layer cakes that I've used part of. I've used part of the layer cake, I put the rest in here. But I also add to that any 10-inch squares that I can cut from any scraps, because when you get down really low, the scraps are really not usable if they are just all stacked in that bin that I showed you. They need to be in usable pieces. And when I see my stack of 10-inch squares, I can just go through these and I can pick out what I want. It's so much easier to make good use out of those pieces. And again, they are valuable pieces of fabric. So as I go through, for me, if you look at this list, check off which item on here, which one of these particular pieces is something you would use. If you would never use a fat eighth, don't cut a fat eighth. You don't need to. But this is just an option if you want to. When you go through that's the large pieces. When you look at the pre-cuts, if you're not going to use 2.5 by 2.5 inch charm squares, don't cut them. I prefer to just leave them in a long strip, and then when I'm ready, I'll need the 2.5 inch strip. It may not be a width of fabric, but I can cut the rectangles that I need out of that. Once you cut it into the 2.5 by 2.5, you're done. So you want to make sure that if you use those a lot, you cut those. If you don't use them, don't cut them. As I go through the list, the pre-cut sizes are pretty general. 2.5 by 2.5, 5 by 5, that's a charm square. 10 by 10 is a layer cake, or it's called a layer cake by Moda. It's just basically a 10 by 10. If you have any of those squares, people tend to call them layer cakes. And then also those long 2.5 inch by width of fabric strips. Again, when they're all together in one batch, one bunch, they're so much easier to find a use for them. And then of course I have my crumbs there as well. So determine your preferences. That's what we want to do. And then customize it. Something that will work for you. Don't cut and make bins and scraps that you will never use. Then it's of no benefit to you, no more than just having everything in a big old bin. So you want to make sure that if it's something that you use, that's what you're going to have. Once again, if you go down the list, you want to make sure that you have everything sorted. Again, sometimes if you have different types of fabrics, if you use cottons and wools and batiks and different things, you may want to sort according to that. Not that you can't use cottons and batiks together, but sometimes some people like those sorted so that you can find the different ones as needed. If that's something that works for you, do that. Also, our storage units are really important, that we have things that work for us. If you have room, I love the stackable drawers. You can take the stackable drawers, they work really well for fat quarters. It's too big for me to show you here, but I have drawers that I have all my fat quarters standing up, sorted according to color. So simple for me to just open it. They're just the ones that you buy from Walmart or wherever, Home Depot, and you can put your fat quarters in there and hold them. If you don't have room for that, boxes work. You can use boxes. Just make sure if you can't see through them that you label what they are on the outside. Otherwise, they're as good as lost. So those are just some suggestions that you have. One idea that I have, you can do it one of two ways. Every time you finish a project, like I did with that bin that I showed you earlier, once you've finished a project, then you can go ahead and scrap bust that project, because you probably have a lot of really great fabrics in there that match. And that way you can put them together, cut them into strips if you want, or do whatever you need to do to make that a usable bin or a usable bag or whatever you have room for. So that's important if you do that after every project. If you don't want to do that, maybe just take 10 minutes a day after you've finished sewing and set that aside for scrap busting, cutting some pieces, cutting some scraps. Just 10 minutes. If you add that every time to your sewing experience, each time you sit at the sewing machine, you're going to be caught up with your scraps, and it's not going to be a problem to have everything organized and ready to go for your next project. Now remember, if you decide to use your 10-minute scrap busting, that's great. If you decide to scrap bust after every project, that's also great. But if you don't do either one of those, scrap bust when your bin is full. If the bin is full, no questions asked, go ahead and scrap bust so that you don't get overwhelmed. Just set aside a sewing time to be able to do that. You can do it in front of the TV. Get your iron out if you prefer to iron them. Take a look and see what the pieces are. Sort them into the bins as you would use them best, and you are one step ahead of the game. That's my scrap busting system. That's what I do. By keeping scraps organized and manageable, you'll maintain a clutter-free sewing room, and you'll always have a stash ready for your next project. Remember, dedicate a bin just for those scraps that you're going to use or you're going to have from any project. Keep it close by, put the scraps in there, and then just scrap bust when it gets full. So I am always trying to be joyful, and scrap busting always helps me feel better about my sewing area, but I will always be merry. Thanks so much for watching.